Welcome. I'm Judy Farvolden, Executive Director of Mobility Network. Before we introduce this session, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event, sponsored by Mobility Network. And here we are at the School of Cities. Mobility Network is an institutional strategic initiative at the University of Toronto. UT's ISIs address humanity's greatest challenges, and grand challenges demand cross-disciplinary and collaborative approach between university researchers, their partners in government, industry, and the public. And in Mobility Network's case, that means recognizing the sustainable, equitable, and efficient movement of people and goods is a regional, national, and global challenge. We intend to harness the incredible depth and breadth of U of T's researchers to catalyze the ways mobility services are offered and used, and how this results in a more equitable, sustainable, and prosperous future. We believe that U of T has a primary role to play in first, understanding the complexity of the challenges facing us, and then translating this understanding into positive and innovative change. We invite you to come on the journey with us. You may know us from past collaborations or events from UTRI, the University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute. There we are. But with Mobility Network, we're taking it up several notches. We now have a group of 60 researchers from across U of T's 3 campuses whose diverse interests span the scope of broad ranges of critical issues about mobility and who will collectively advance the Mobility Network agenda. As you know, transportation touches virtually all aspects of our lives. We've named this panel's discussion series The Way Forward, since it's the starting point of our journey. We'll hope you'll join Mobility Network as we explore paths towards sustainable and equitable mobility. Each session of The Way Forward is designed to address one of the factors critical to this journey. This afternoon, our topic for discussion is titled Designing Complete Communities. Scooted forward too far. And before I hand the mic to Eric, I'd like to acknowledge the passing of Kathleen Llewellyn-Thomas, a friend and colleague to many of us today, and many more in our region and across Canada. A uniquely gifted engineer, Kathleen brought a poet's heart and keen mind to design, build, and manage inclusive urban communities in the belief that cities should work for every resident. And with Kathleen's inspiration in mind, I'm delighted to turn the podium over to our panel moderator, Dr. Eric Miller.
Thank you, Judy. And for any of you who don't know me, I'm Eric Miller. I'm a professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering, and I'm the director of Mobility Network. And as Judy mentioned, I'm also very pleased to be the moderator of today's panel, Designing Complete Communities. Ontario's growth plan promotes the development of complete communities where people can live, work, shop, and access services in close proximity through a mix of housing types, diversity of land uses, community amenities, and street connectivity. The City of Toronto's official plan review has a policy focus on neighborhoods and complete communities and what is needed to make them thriving and inclusive. Today, our panelists are going to talk about what makes a community complete, what makes it inclusive, according to whose definition of complete and community. We have 3 panelists. Each will take a few minutes to share remarks. Then we have a bit of a panel discussion, and then we'll open up to questions. Please post your questions in the chat. I'll introduce each of our panelists in turn. Our first one with is Matti Siemiatycki, who is a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning, Geography and Program and Planning, and the director and co-founder of the Infrastructure Institute at the School of Cities. The Infrastructure Institute builds local and global expertise in infrastructure planning, decision-making, and delivery. Matti's teaching and research likewise focuses on infrastructure planning, finance, and project delivery. Building on his policy paper, Transit-Oriented Communities, Why We Need Them and How We Can Make Them Happen, Matti is going to remind us that we already know about the importance of density, diversity, design, and complete communities. Matti is going the extra mile for us today, thanks to the marvels of modern telecommunications. He's joining us from Paris, where I have no doubt he's spending his time investigating the completeness of the Paris communities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matti.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you all the way from Paris. and connecting back with home, even as I'm overseas. Transit-oriented communities are at the core of an effective transit system. And, for the longest time, we thought of development around transit stations as transit-oriented development. That was how the literature spoke about it, and that's how we, as in the transportation planning and project delivery community, thought about it. That the aim was to get development. So this was more dense, intensive land use closer to transit stations. And so every effort was put in place to bring the development closer to the stations. What we've learned over time is that goal is not enough, that just having development adjacent to transit is not enough, that transit really plays two roles in communities. One, it serves the mobility needs of people who are already there. And second, it shapes the land uses around the transit stations. It brings additional value, and that value then guides what happens around the stations. And so for the longest time, we thought about just trying to get density around stations. And if you think about our system in Toronto, the reality is that the record has been decidedly mixed. If you were to fly over the city of Toronto, even today, you could probably, with a discerning eye, pick out the Yonge line from the air. Going from south to north, you would see Union Station, King, Queen, Dundas, College. Yonge and Bloor now has a lot of tall buildings around it. Yonge and St. Clair has a cluster from the 70s and 80s. Yonge and Eglinton now is booming. And then you would see North York Civic Center. And if you haven't been to North York Civic Center recently, it has all the makings of a downtown core, and that was very much intentional. However, if you were also to look for the Bloor Danforth line, just as an example, you would find some pretty big gaps in that route. Through much of the center of the city, and especially along the Danforth itself, there's actually been fairly limited development and growth around the stations, even as our city has grown quite substantially. And likewise, if you were to look at the GO network, you would also find a pretty mixed story and a lot of surface parking lots still there. So, this is the process of attracting development close to transit is one that seems like it should be natural, and it should be something that happens hand in glove. And yet what we've learned in our own community in the Toronto region is that this takes both careful planning and execution by a variety of partners that cross the public and private sectors. Now, to come back to this idea of transit-oriented developments shifting to transit-oriented communities, this is, I think, really essential to how we're going to get the most out of our transit systems. That the goal, historically, as I said, was to get to transit-oriented development. And so going back to a really prominent paper by Robert Cervero and Kara Kockelman, there was three features of transit-oriented development. Density, diversity, and design. That you wanted density, you needed a diversity of usages, and then high quality design is what made those communities sing, what made them really effective. And I think that's where we're at now, is being much more intentional, not just about transit adjacent development, but really getting to transit oriented communities. And in our context, this requires, again, a lot of cooperation across the municipal sector, which is largely in control of land use, the provinces, which play a significant role, for example, in funding education, where schools are key, plus some of the other civic infrastructure that's necessary, and then the federal government as well, who can come to the table with all sorts of resources to help make these communities work. So I think maybe that's where I'll stop, is just by highlighting that. As you know, I'll say one more point. We're seeing across our region all sorts of nodes of transit-oriented communities starting to take shape. And most interestingly, they're happening to a large extent in the suburbs. So this is a really exciting opportunity where some of the largest plots of land where transit-oriented communities can thrive, can take shape, are old shopping centers, often along existing transit lines or where new transit lines are being built. You can think of Square One, you can think of Vaughan Metropolitan Center, the Richmond Hill Station, which I'm sure we'll get into, which has had a lot of discussion up the Yonge line. Brampton Uptown, which a number of us have been involved in, and Brampton is working very hard to coordinate and achieve a real transit-oriented community at its core. So these are happening, and then Scarborough Town Center would be another one. So these are happening right across our region, and I think there's a big opportunity to move from transit-oriented development to transit-oriented communities. It's a single word difference, development to community, but it makes all the difference when you're talking about the types of services that allow people to live, work, and play close by, and not think of these as just bedrooms that will drive higher transit by putting development adjacent to new stations.
Okay, thank you, Matti. Our next panelist is Rob Wright. Rob is an associate professor in the Daniels Faculty of Architecture and Design, and also the director of its Center for Landscape Research. As both an educator and as a design practitioner, Rob holds a strong belief that design is built theory, meaning that the translation from thought and concept to built works is primary and essential to design discourse. Today, Rob is going to challenge us to think about the meaning of the terms complete and community. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, great, thanks. So complete community is one of those terms that we're hearing a lot about these days. And what I'd like to challenge the notion of it, unlike complete streets, which is based on a more comprehensive framework of an existing system, complete communities is a little more free range, so to speak. The key ideas in complete communities are always land use, employment, transportation, housing, and density. And what I'd like you to think today about is what land uses are they referring to, what employment, what employment mixes, what mobility types, what housing types, and at what density. We throw these terms around so much these days that it's becoming very difficult to actually tell what are the significant differences and how they actually combine themselves. As a little exercise, I threw off to an AI-generated writing system called GP3 called Wright. I asked it what is a complete community, and it came back with a huge number of definitions, but almost word for word the one that Eric shared with us. But I think it's the second definition I like the best. It says, I think it's best if we make our own definition of what a complete community is, as there are many definitions out there. So one of the issues for me around the notion of complete community is what is the problem context? Because are we assuming that complete communities are based on spatial aspects? And if so, what are the physical and spatial metrics that we're actually using? And if it's social, how are we defining those in terms of the social cultural metrics, which are often aspatial but more relational? And then what levels of scale and complexity are we actually working at? One of the things I've realized looking at generative design as it's related to complete communities is that there is a certain scale relationship at which point, if you're too fine, you can't do very much because everything else in the system is set. And if it's too large, it's too free range, and there's nothing that actually defines how the system can be designed. So what is the relationship of social interaction to placement? If you look at the European Union's knowledge network and their ontologies of urbanism, there are 254 central concepts to what makes great urbanism. And you can see here, transportation, of course, is listed in the center of those things. And I will argue today that transportation and mobility is actually central to the concept of a complete community. In the best document I found, and I've left the link with it to Pat so she can share it with all of you. There is a document called Where Are We There Yet? And it talks about the relationship of mobility to complete communities. And in that description, they have a series of four areas that they believe are important, and they actually identify the indicators. And so all of you people that are interested in transportation, they give the amount. So I'll just read a few of these off because I want to leave time for the discussion. But for example, under living, what are the percent of households near fixed guided transit? You know, and what selection of units are there in terms of fixed opportunity areas? I'll go to the next one. Working in terms of what jobs are related to transit, what percentage of 18 to 34-year-olds with college degrees are near to transit routes? These are large, I won't read them all out. percentage of commuters who take transit from, and they list where these indicators are coming from, percentage of commuters who walk and bike, and finally the thriving, which is the more social things, low-income households more than a mile from a major grocery store, percent of population with no regular physical activity in the community, percent of households who live near parks, etc. So I think what's critical for me is when we think about these things, that we really need to put the components or operationalize the definitions so we can actually define. I don't think you actually make a complete community. I think they actually merge, as Matti was talking about in terms of the different networks. They actually emerge from the way things are structured. Because if it was so easy to understand that, we would actually have an indication of where the complete communities are in Toronto. And I think one of the things I like about Toronto is some of the incompleteness of communities and the way they're actually structured. So I hope that will add some to the debate here.
One always has to remember to unmute and when you want to jump into the conversation. Thank you very much, Rob. And so our third panelist, let me just find my notes, is Margaret Kohn. Margaret is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and the chair of the Department of Political Science. Margaret's primary research interests are in the areas of the history of political thought, critical theory, social justice, and urbanism. Today, Margaret will draw on her recent publication in The Conversation, Housing Co-ops Could Solve Canada's Housing Affordability Crisis, to tell us where housing co-ops fit in thinking on complete communities. Over to you, Margaret.
Hello. The title of my talk is From Complete Communities to the Just City. So when I first kind of encountered this concept of complete communities, it sounded pretty familiar to me. And I think that's because it's been a dominant principle in urbanism, in planning for a long time. It dates back at least as far as Jane Jacobs and her path-breaking book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And since then, it's gone through other iterations. And the one I put up here on the slide is the new urbanism. And that's because it was a very influential movement that I think had some of the same objectives. And it had a big impact on planning in Florida, where I lived and had my first job after graduate school. And so the principles of this movement were density, diversity of housing, mixed land uses, and the integration of employment and transit. And so the kind of focus of my comments is going to be that even though these are, I think, still principles that we very much endorse, we have to think about how they're realized in practice and also which sorts of features we want to prioritize and which are most important if we want to maintain the accessibility of our communities to rich and poor alike. When I think about these issues, really impactful for me was David Holchansky's 3 Cities in Toronto. When you look at that, you see along transit lines, but it's typically more affluent communities. That's the way the market works. People want to live near transit. They're able to pay for it. They bid up the costs on the market. And so I think affordability in housing, decommodified forms of housing are actually a very important feature of complete communities and one that can easily be overlooked. So here's the cautionary tale. This is it was a new urbanist community that was constructed in Gainesville, Florida, maybe not as famous as the ones designed directly by the practitioners of the new urbanism, such as Seaside, Florida, or Celebration, Florida, but it was something, pretty similar. So you can see here some of the principles that I put up on the earlier slide. You do have more dense housing compared to a typical suburban dwelling. There are these more apartment-style dwellings on top of commercial locations. And you have a kind of more an integration of different land uses. You have, on the one hand, commerce integrated with housing, as well as recreation and cultural amenities. And you also, I think, have some pretty attractive design. It's less obvious in these images, but there was also, I think, a very interesting structure to enhance walkability. There were walking and running paths between the neighborhoods that made it possible to move about without having to go on the typical suburban road system. Nevertheless, overall, the orientation towards transit and to employment were kind of secondary to the design features that made this a kind of attractive form of, high-end real estate consumption. So I put this up here as a kind of cautionary tale of how things can go wrong if we take these principles outside of the context of an explicit just city framework. The alternative, the one that I'd like to celebrate and kind of remind us of, is a very successful project that was built here in Toronto, and that is the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood. So this was a mixed land use type project, and of course it was well integrated with transit and employment. And this is in part because the site itself was already walking distance to downtown shopping and to employment and to entertainment and culture. You know how it's located just north of the highway and in direct proximity to transit lines. So it's pretty easy to create this mix. The industrial land that was no longer economically viable was available for redevelopment as residential land. So what was more intentional and I think really important for us to kind of make explicit and remember and foreground was an explicit strategy to diversify housing. So in this neighborhood, housing was provided for a mix of single persons, couples, families with children, and senior citizens, but also, and this is what's really important, it consisted of a mix of tenure type, including non-market housing. So 39% of the total units were condominium apartments, 30% are nonprofit co-ops and nonprofit rentals, and 27% are municipal nonprofit rentals. And I think this is important to point out because when you look at what often the city is proposing today, it's at most a third of some sort of subsidized housing. And here we actually see the majority are these nonprofit projects. So how did this come about? Well, I think it's also important to emphasize that it came about through municipal leadership. So there was a very active social planning process. And after the community identified things they wanted, like recreational centers, schools, health clinics, there was a decision made that those key features would be placed in the city-owned municipal nonprofits to ensure it wasn't left to the vagaries of the market to ensure that this social dimension and relational dimension was realized. And so to kind of sum it all up, there was explicitly an urban justice focus. The idea at the front and center was to provide housing for all income groups, and in particular to families with moderate to low household incomes. So now I would like to drill down a little bit more deeply to a granular level of how this was accomplished. My focus here is less on transit and more on housing, which I think is like a key anchor of complete communities. So here I put an image of this co-op, because I think while there's a large number of very successful housing cooperatives in Ontario, it's not necessarily that well known as model. So just to throw up a definition, housing cooperative is a democratically controlled association that provides housing for its members. So that can include for-profit co-ops, but the typical nonprofit Canadian housing co-op owns residential units and rents them to members at cost, and the membership ends when the residents move out. So one thing about the, I think, very helpful legal structure of the nonprofit housing sector in Canada is that it integrates within the very legal structure a number of very positive features that ensure long-term benefits. The first one is democratic governance. So housing cooperatives elect a board of directors, and they also approve the budget. Second of all, they have a culture of participation. Sometimes this is legally required, sometimes it's more an informal practice, but the idea is people get to know their neighbors by participating, whether it's on a social committee or a gardening committee, and this can also have the effect of keeping costs down. Third, they are mixed income. While cooperatives can be organized in different ways, the ones that were subsidized by the Ontario and federal governments usually reserved 1/3 of the units for rent geared to income families. So while 2/3 of the people living there pay market rates, 1/3 pay a fixed percentage of their income and is topped up with a subsidy. And then the last kind of key feature is that they are affordable in perpetuity. So even the so-called market rates, of course, are not really market rate because they just are housing charges that cover the cost of maintaining the unit or paying off the mortgage if there is a mortgage on the building. So once that is paid off, costs can be then quite low, and they are not going to be sold off to the highest bidder. So to wrap up, I just wanted to kind of pose this question of what exactly can we do to implement a just city strategy. And so I want to leave with three key ideas. The first one is the idea of solidarism. That's a term that you might not be familiar with. It's a kind of obscure term from the history of political thought from 19th century France, but I think it's a philosophy that's really worth reanimating today because it's based on the idea of interdependence and sharing. It builds on the recognition that we've created cities and industries collectively by working together through a division of labor. And what we have to do is think about how we want to share the benefits of this incredibly productive social cooperation. And I think this is an idea which is really useful for thinking about urban issues. Now, we talk about like housing not being affordable, which is true, but there's also people who have made a lot of money on the increase in value of residential properties. And so that's a kind of unearned increment that they experience as naturally belonging to them, even though they've probably done nothing to kind of earn it or deserve it. And so if we think of it as kind of this benefit of the urban environment we live in collectively, I think we can also detach ourselves from seeing it as purely private and think about how maybe through some kind of taxation on the capital gains of residential property, we could gather some financial resources in order to pay for the other priorities we have in cities, whether it's investment in public transit on the one hand, which is very costly, or in funding the nonprofit housing cooperative programs that haven't been funded since the 1980s. So the money's there, but we have to recognize them as collective resources that we can use to solve these urban problems. And so then the final point, and I'll just end there, is public sector leadership. We think we see that in the very successful St. Lawrence Market project, and that we should be more open to that type of leadership as we continue to work together to try and build complete communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Margaret, and thank you to all our panelists. So now we're into the second segment of the session, where I want to probe the panelists in various ways, get a bit of a conversation going among the panelists. And maybe to begin, and this is a question to all three of them, maybe they can each take a kick at this. Margaret mentioned Jane Jacobs, New Urbanism. You know, arguably under different names, we've been talking about this for a long time. The 3Ds, transit-oriented development, now transit-oriented communities, New Urbanism, live-work relationships, self-contained communities. There's been lots of different concepts. The 15-minute city. There seems to be, among urbanists, a strong consensus about the advantages of this sort of way of building our cities. And yet, over the last 70 years, shall we say, since the World War II in particular, we've built cities to a fair extent differently. And even though we continue to talk about these things, we still see traditional development, if you will, going on in many cases. So I'd like each of you to talk a little bit about what are the barriers to transit-oriented communities? What are the barriers to more, a more integrated, mixed-use, complete community? What are some of the obstacles that we have that prevent us from doing more of this? I mean, Matti mentioned we're starting to do some of these things, but it's still a struggle. So I don't know, Matti, maybe would you like to start? Any comments you have?
Yeah, so I think that the barriers are in the application. I think we have all the knowledge we need. and we know how to do it. The question is, can in our system get it together and get all the different players rowing in the same direction to actually make these projects work. You know, Margaret talked about St. Lawrence Market, which is a phenomenal example. And I've been reading a bit about that project recently. And what you realize is the role of the federal government in particular with housing money and the provincial governments being at the table too was really significant. And that project, unlike many projects, was not farmed out to consultants. That project was developed and designed by the city with a whole array of different professionals and then community groups as well. So it's a really stunning difference from how we do things, where over much of that period, Eric, that we've been talking about, the federal government has stepped back from housing in particular, from funding, especially cooperative housing, and the provincial government has had a mixed degree of involvement. And I think where we're really struggling now is getting everyone to pull in the same direction and to really both set a vision and then to follow through on the type of investment that you need and the degree to which it needs to be coordinated. So just to give you some really concrete examples, I mean, at the core of a complete community is, for example, a school. The school is designated by the provincial government through like a really complex and specific formula for when they decide a new school is needed. And if we take the example of Canoe Landing, just as one case, that's in the railway lands. That school showed up, the school just opened like last year or 2 years ago in a project that started in the early 2000s. So that's an entire generation of kids who lived in a very dense area, but didn't even have a local school right in their neighborhood that they could go to. And we're seeing the same thing now playing out as we try to design a school and bring together a community hub in Brampton and in some of the other projects that we're focusing on. And it's not that we don't know that we need these services at the core of our communities. It's that it's really challenging to get everyone and all of the different silos to dissolve and develop them. And just one last thought is that you know, Eric, you mentioned how suburban we are as a city and as a country. I mean, David Gordon's work from Queens suggests that 2/3 of our region is actually something that's closer to a suburban area. So we're really playing catch up as we try to go down the path of building complete communities. And I think the hardest challenge here is to allow transit-oriented communities to be built without spurring displacement. Development without displacement is going to be key because many of the places, if you look at the map and you think of where the new developments are taking place, many of the new lines are now being built in lower income areas. And that's important to serve communities that have often been underserved. But the flip side is that we do run the risk of displacement. As Margaret said, the land values go up, the development starts to take place, and the cycles of gentrification can get going if we're not really careful and intentional to avoid them.
Great. Rob, would you maybe like to pick up on that? One way or another?
I think a lot of it, Matti's really touched on some really important things. You know, one of the things that, you know, you could be more optimistic about is that certain things are happening in the suburbs, which are very interesting. The transit lines are going there. They're intensifying their cores. All against what the province wants us to do is build more highways and free up more greenfield land. But there's certain successes that are actually starting to happen there. Time is a very important thing, but that mix that Matti said, you know, if the system relies entirely on a capital system, there's no way that you can transfer affordability. Our great successes in housing were subsidized, always were subsidized. You know, this is a conversation I have with David Crombie all the time. We subsidized St. Lawrence, the Bay Navir Co-op, the CMHC gave mortgages to cooperatives and other things like that. So they actually added a balancing thing. Right now, the way we're designing is it's very much, we just sort of reach out and then try to backfill in to these areas. And of course, if you look at the housing costs, there's just no way that we're actually going to bridge the kind of completeness of these communities by having the mix that we need relative to the housing types that we're going to need and the uses, et cetera, without actually shifting the way we're actually planning.
And Margaret, how would you like to weigh in on this?
I think it's all about the money. That's why I ended my comments by talking about solidarism as a kind of way of thinking about maybe justifications for at least a partial tax on capital gains of a primary residence. I think, you know, it's hard for people to accept that possibility. But, you know, when I think about that house that I bought in 2009 for $450,000, and I'm not even going to tell you what it was worth when I sold it. And trust me, like, I'm not handy. I was not fixing it up or renovating or improving it. It was really just, the overall market, the effect of the city. And so this is like an unearned increment that could be, at least in part, like reallocated to funding these things that we desperately need. When I was sort of watching this debate about subways versus LRTs in Scarborough play out, I mean, to me, it seemed like both and, like, we need them both. Like, it's such a big area and we need so much transit there. And the problem, I think, is that it is costly. When I compare it to something like the Grand Paris, Paris program, which I believe committed 40 billion euros, the amount of money we're spending is so low. And I think it will generate all sorts of social benefits and economic benefits, but it does require public funding. And so I think that's why we have to include that along with these sort of like design and planning issues about who we are as a society, and that we have, solidarity with the rest of the members of our society.
So I'd like to push this a little further, but focus particularly on the role of the public sector. As a preamble, I often feel that, particularly in the Toronto area, maybe in Ontario and Canada, we often forget what we do well, and we forget what our successes are, and we wander off into the wilderness. And I wonder, so we have the example of St. Lawrence, et cetera. We used to have a much heftier public sector involvement in affordable housing and community design, and as Matti pointed out, at all levels. So what happened? Why did we walk away from this? This has been decades in the process. Any thoughts about why we gave up on that public sector model and sort of turned it over to the private sector? I mean, obviously there needs to be a partnership, but and maybe how do we get it back? How do we get back to a better balance and better public sector involvement? Rob,
I think, Eric, one of the issues is the way we do planning and the fact that it's controlled by the province, even at the local level. There's a level of control there that becomes politically ideological at some point, where cities like Toronto or even in suburban places are put under the auspices of planning directives, ministerial orders, etc., that are outside of any continuity that people are trying to do at the local level. I mean, I think that's for me a real barrier in terms of that. Most cities in the world that are the size of Toronto, or even areas that are the size of the GTA, have a lot of autonomy and responsibility for their development. In terms of the way they operate. So I think that's one thing. It's political. Secondly, we often talk about Matti's been part of this. We're talking about in Brampton and other things like that, are trying to do these things. They have seemed to have very little gravity or awareness in terms of our general public, in terms of our planning systems. Seems to be a real lack of it. Matti's in Paris, which is, one of those cities where everything's up for debate in terms of all the time. And you can barely have a conversation if you talk about affordability houses and where affordability takes place and everything like that. I sometimes think as academics, we're so isolated from what people are actually thinking about. It can be a real issue.
Yeah, Eric, can I make perhaps a slightly different point, and I'll say it in a way to be a bit provocative, but I'm not sure we need to set up a binary between the private sector, and the public sector, and view this as like the public sector is on the side of the angels and the private sector is the rapacious capitalists who are only trying to get in and get out as fast as they can. I mean, there are certainly those type of developers who are out there who will do the least humanly possible to get their project done and try to squeeze as much profit out of it. I think, but that's not the whole industry. And I think what we're seeing now, and the part that gives me a lot of optimism and hope in the work that I've been doing, is we're seeing developers that, not out of altruism, but out of enlightened self-interest, will come to the table and do projects that are much more creative than and willing to be more ambitious around their social objectives and in many cases their environmental objectives than the path of least resistance. And in my work, I've been focusing on what we've been calling creative mixed-use buildings. These are buildings that blend public, private, and nonprofit spaces in the same building. And this is, Rob said it, like, we don't celebrate our successes. This is something that we do in Toronto and to Canada to a lesser extent, probably better than anyone else in the world. And we do it out of necessity, not by design. But these, you can think of projects in our region like North Toronto Collegiate Institute, which is a school with a condo up above it, or TIFF Bell Lightbox, again, a major arts facility that was funded in part by the condo up above. And we're starting to push the envelope into the social realm as well. Think of something like the Red Door Shelter in the east end of the city, which is an upscale condominium, mid-rise, with a homeless shelter for women and families built right into the side of the building. These are really important examples. This is public, private, and nonprofit coming together to deliver the types of important services all in the same building. And you can think of now Eva's Phoenix at the Waterworks and others blending YMCAs with student housing up above, all sorts of ways that developers are working with communities, and we're getting a cohort of people in the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector who can do these types of projects. I think that's where there's a lot of excitement and potential optimism for how our communities are going to evolve. And I would try to differentiate and not sort of pigeonhole each of the sectors, but rather try to think in a nuanced way that there are some who do great in the public sector and some who do less well, and some in the private and nonprofit in the same vein.
I would certainly agree. It's certainly not either or, and trying to get that mix is critical. Margaret, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. To go back to your original question about what happened, well, there was this financial crisis in Canada in the early 1980s, deindustrialization, a debt crisis, and I think there just simply wasn't like the willingness to invest in housing at the federal or provincial level, and these programs just ended. And so that's kind of the broader structural context. There's also an ideological context, though. I mean, think about the other thing happening in the 80s. This is Thatcher, Reagan, a new emphasis on neoliberalism, the idea that, the state is always going to be working very inefficiently or is going to be harmful to get involved in projects like this, that the private sector is always going to be more efficient and more effective. And so I think we do have to challenge some of those ideas in order to come up with the right mix, and that there's opportunities to kind of rethink how we, understand the opportunities on the public sector side also. And so, turning to these examples in Toronto, all of which sound very exciting, I do think sometimes this occludes, though, the possibility of 100% affordable housing, that we've done that. And if the city land is available, why not consider something like cooperatives, where 2/3 is going to be market rate affordable middle income housing and 1/3 is going to be subsidized. And so you could really just provide more units more quickly. And given the scale of the crisis around housing affordability, that's something that at least should be up for consideration, even if it's not appropriate for all projects. And we, of course, should use the whole wide range of tools.
Okay, great. I've been starting to scan some of the questions in the chat, and maybe transition to that a bit. I may still come back with a question or two, but one question that I had, my ears perked up. This is to Rob. In what ways do you prefer the incompleteness of certain communities in Toronto? Do you have any specific examples of these communities? I mean, I think that's a very, we're all about completeness. So what about incompleteness? When does that work?
Well, I think cities, completeness, I always use a kind of health analogy. It's like we want the perfect human being. There is no perfect human being, there is no perfect health situation. There's no perfect, we set up all these sort of parameters, as we say, density, mixed use and everything like that. And I think that's something that it emerges over time, for one thing, but it also emerges, for example, in the housing thing. Why do we release new land for housing until we fill up the land we've already got for housing? So as one example. And incompleteness for me is all the cities that I love, Paris, I grew up in Paris. All the cities I love, I love the areas that are the most incomplete. I love Kensington Market and St. Lawrence Market and other places like that for some of the differences they have. I'm sure the people in the beaches love it because of their access to water, which they maybe affects circulation and things like that. The reality is, Eric, we don't really have a complete definition for what a community is. Like, where's the boundary of a kind of community? We use the term almost like marketing now. Doug Ford is using the term to justify all of the things he's doing. They want to build more complete communities in, North on Yonge. In transit oriented, they're using that term again in terms of that stuff. And I think, Matti's right. There's these unique situations, these what I would call incomplete. They started incomplete. For example, Mirvish Village, which is being developed now, is another one, Matti, which is in an area which is very different. It doesn't have all the employment, doesn't have necessarily as good transit, but it's going to add to that situation. So I just think I guess it's my argument is around the term itself. The minute somebody says something's complete, I find that antithetical to how cities actually grow.
So, and maybe following up on that, another question in the chat is, what kind of people would be more attracted to live in complete communities? Not everyone is interested in all of the features that are included. I get the sense there is an assumption that complete communities are universally attractive. And so, yeah, is this, so anybody want to respond to that question? Different strokes for different people. Some people, really like their quiet, traditional suburb, right? And don't want the vibe of the downtown and, different things. So where do we sit in terms of providing perhaps a spectrum of opportunities for people in an urban region? Anybody want to pick up on that? No.
No. Margaret, do you want to go, or I can take that one?
Sure, I just have like a brief thought, and this kind of draws on my experience in Florida. I think that the sales prices in these new urbanist communities like Hale Plantation and Town of Tioga, the housing prices were higher. People did want that. Like, we see that, like, that is what the market will bear, but it's not affordable for everybody. And so again, I think that, where we sort of end up with some of the attractive pieces missing, it's because it costs more and people are priced out of accessing that supposedly complete community.
Matti, did you have a comment as well?
Yeah, it was in a similar vein that I think we haven't always recognized both sort of the 880 view of complete communities or the price view. It's kind of where I started, that because the goal was around transit-oriented development, not necessarily community, but development. Any development that took place around the stations was seen as a plus. And I think what we're seeing as we go back and look in more detail is oftentimes the units have been too small, or they haven't factored in spaces for children. Again, to come back to the railway lands, there have been stories over the years about many families, like there was no school there, but many families still lived there. They often lived in very small condo size units, and then used the neighborhood as their living room, their dining room, their rec center, and their public square. And I think we haven't, because of who we've envisioned as being the person that is going to live there. Oftentimes the market has driven them towards smaller units, smaller both in terms of the physical footprint and in terms of the number of bedrooms. And I think we need to now put affordability right at the core. I think the types of amenities that are built in have to be much more considerate. Otherwise, people will vote with their feet. And we saw during the pandemic, the price of real estate in the suburbs went up the fastest. And the speculation was this was because people wanted to flee the city. I think actually what we're seeing now is people either coming back to the city, or the city, people recognizing that actually being in a vibrant location close to transit and somewhere you can walk and cycle is actually really good for their quality of life. But we have to factor that in as we're building communities. And I think that question is right about picturing who's going to live there and make sure affordability and livability are at the core.
Yeah, I think we have to provide a variety of opportunities for people. But, one of my little quips is Matti's in Paris. Everybody goes to Paris. Everybody loves Paris. And then they come home and say, oh, but we can't do that here, right? And somehow we're different. But I also wonder that I always have a concern that we can get locked into too much into the neighborhood, the community, and not think about how it sits within the city in the region, right? And should we be thinking more about a complete city? I mean, we went from complete streets to complete community are we not maybe looking to build a mosaic in the city? And maybe, and this is one of the strengths of Toronto, is it has its neighborhoods, and any one neighborhood is maybe not complete, but you could hop on, 2 subway stops and you're someplace completely different. And should we be thinking perhaps more largely, at least in some cases, about how the whole urban fabric is evolving? Now that's a big question. But then maybe how does we build the city piece by piece, parcel by parcel, block by block? But how do we build a mosaic? I mean, that's a very loose, open-ended question. I don't know if anybody. Rob's nodding.
It's because you and I talk about this a lot. It's the diversity of the network and what it supplies. I mean, another limiting factor is zoning. The way we zone, we have kind of exclusionary type of zoning. We talk about the yellow districts and stuff like that. Many of the cities, like Paris and everything, they're a little more adaptable around different kind of buildings and uses and how they come together. I think of the example in Toronto, the 2 Kings, which were under Bedford when he was doing the thing, were really a process of negotiation to preserve historical properties and mix the zoning up as much as possible on some of the industrial buildings that we're converting or office to commercial office, providing a lot of flexibility sort of to act in the public interest to see what can come out of a bigger mix. And of course, Matti has been doing nothing but studying mix, but it opened up a whole way of thinking about zoning as opposed to, this is what I want, you can't have it, let's go to the OMB. And that it was more of a creative process where we actually thought about the things that you're talking about, where are the opportunities for affordability, how do we build them, what are they adjacent to, because it's a system. The thing that makes Toronto interesting or living in the downtown is not because of your own neighborhood, it's because of where you can go in a very quick proximity to yourself to do other things as well. I live up Bloor off of Ossington, and I go down the street, and Ossington's a whole different world when I cross over 2 blocks. And that's something that makes it, but my area is very quiet and semi-detached.
Yeah, Margaret, go ahead.
So I spend a lot of time in Scarborough, and the strip malls of Scarborough might seem like, quite different than, let's say, the boulevards of Paris. But I want to say that they're this kind of incredibly vibrant mosaic, that there are all sorts of small businesses that cater to local populations and cultural institutions that create this really wonderful fabric for flourishing life. And that, a first step is also to kind of see that and recognize that and value that. That's something I've really learned from my students out there. But there are some things that communities can't really just easily do on their own. Like they can open up these wonderful businesses in the strip malls. And that is the transit piece of it, because, subways do cost billions of dollars to build. And so there's a piece that I think that, we as Toronto, as the broader city, because you asked about how we position this in the broader city with the broader tax base, need to recognize the needs there and take a transit justice frame and thinking about how to meet those needs. So that these vibrant mosaic communities are integrated into the broader city more efficiently.
Eric, can I pick up on something that Michael Rochlau said in the chat? Because I think it's so important. Me sitting in Paris, and we've referenced Paris a number of times. I mean, when you come to visit Paris as a tourist, you tend to come to the city center, and it's gorgeous, and you wonder and say, why can't every part of every city be like this? I mean, this part of the city is also essentially a museum. It's like an urban museum. It's like going to Disneyland for cities. And if you were to, as Michael says, most of the part outside of the first ring road is very suburban, is very auto-oriented, and has many layered social challenges as well. And in many ways, Toronto, I think we're trying to grapple with our own legacy and our own history, and especially in the inner suburbs. Rob talked about this earlier. In the outer suburbs, we are trying to reconceive what a suburb is, but we're having very intentionally between the public, the private, and private sector, these conversations about how you do this in a more equitable way. And in fact, in many ways, I'm very optimistic about Toronto and our approach because of how front and center we've put questions of equity, and because of how front and center we're trying to grapple with what it means to be built around the car, not just in the downtown core, but actually try to change mobility patterns and densities and commute and the definition of community in the suburbs. I think that's a really giant challenge that if we can get right in Toronto, that has a lot to say for many other cities that are going down this path and have similar land use patterns and are grappling with the same issues we are.
Okay, I actually think that's perhaps a great point to stop. We could, I'm sure, as usual, go on all afternoon, but I think it is actually an optimistic note. It's very easy for us to say, look at all things that we're doing wrong and criticize ourselves for not celebrating our successes. But I think there are things going on out there, as we have talked about today, that give us a lot of experimentation going on, and I think that's good. So I would like to thank our three panelists for very provocative and informative discussions and conversation. A lot to chew on, a lot to think about. As usual, we couldn't possibly get to all the good comments in the chat, but they're there for people to look at. So I think it's time for me to turn it back over to Judy to wrap up things for today. Judy, are you there?
I was muted. Thank you for joining us. Thanks everybody. What a great discussion. How many great questions. I'm left with so much to think about. This is the 6th and the 7th series panel of 7 discussions. We'll be back in 3 weeks, not 2 weeks, usually 2 weeks, but it's 3 weeks for harnessing intelligence and transportation systems. And registration is open for this last sessions. You'll find them advertised on the website. You'll get your reminders if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and you can do that subscription on our website. And you can always find out more by contacting us. One more presentation for this spring 2022 series, but we'll be back in the fall with more to talk about in the way forward. We still hope to see you again in 3 weeks. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody.